Alright, greetings and welcome back. Now if you've been following along with the videos up to this point, we've taken a look at the Photoshop interface, we've taken a look at navigating through your documents, zooming in, panning and whatnot, but we haven't really done anything in Photoshop. So now it's time to get your hands a little bit dirty. What we're going to do is take a basic look at painting inside of Photoshop. This is the bare bones. Now if you've been toying around with Photoshop for a while, you may already know a lot of this stuff, but we got to go through it anyway. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is jump over to the File menu and go down to New. Now I'm currently using Photoshop's kind of standard defaults. It really doesn't matter what size canvas you have. As long as you have a little bit of room to work on, then you'll be fine. I'm just going to click OK with a standard 5x7. Now let's take a look at actually painting. I do want to mention something though. When you watch me paint, I will not be painting with the mouse. If you're having to follow along with a mouse, that's perfectly fine. You'll get everything you need to know anyway, but I actually have a digital tablet that I'll be doing a lot of my painting with, so my lines will be pretty fluid. If you have one yourself, I highly recommend that you use it. If you don't, that's okay. Really, the whole point here is just to get across how a lot of these painting tools work here within Photoshop itself. So the first tool we're going to take a look at is the brush tool. Now that is attached to the B key on your keyboard, so at any time while you're using Photoshop, you can tap B and you are using the brush tool. It's pretty straightforward. You click and drag, or you apply pressure with a digital stylus, and you are drawing right there on your canvas. It's creating a whole bunch of little tiny repetitious stamps of ink, so to speak, that is placing a stroke right down on your page. That's pretty easy. Now I just undid both of those strokes. The way I did that was with Control Alt Z. I didn't just use Control Z because I had multiple undos to go through. And we'll talk a little bit about stepping through history a little later on. Now, of course, you don't just have to hit undo to undo a brush stroke. If you drag something out, like if I just create like a line and I need to get rid of that, I can also erase. And you have an eraser tool over here inside the toolbar as well. You'll notice it's about halfway down the tool panel, and it's bound to the E key by default. So you can just tap E and you can click and drag and you can erase it, erase your line just like you would if you had a little pencil eraser. The other painting tool I want to mention is the pencil tool, which I only use in very special cases, but it's important enough for me to actually bring it up to you because it allows us to illustrate a very special point. All across Photoshop's tool panel, you're going to see many tools that have this little tiny black arrow in the lower right corner. And what that's telling you is that this is not just a tool, this is actually a group of tools all attached together. If you click and hold your mouse button on these, you get a little flyout menu that gives you a list of all of the tools currently underneath that button. So we have the brush tool, the pencil tool, we also have the color replacement tool and the mixer brush tool. These last two we won't be talking about in this video. But we can switch over to the pencil tool like so, and now we can click and drag. Now the difference between the brush and the pencil tool is that the pencil tool has no softening whatsoever. So those pixel edges are going to be very, very apparent. You're going to see that blockiness. Each individual square pixel is really going to jump out at you. It's useful when you really have to get down and clean up single pixels at a time. So for a lot of web graphics work, I will reach for the pencil tool to draw very, very precise lines that have no softening around the edges whatsoever. So it's just a quick look at the three tools I want to focus on, at least in terms of this basic painting video. Once again, those are the brush tool, the eraser tool, and the pencil tool. Now let's talk a little bit about actually creating some lines here on our canvas. There's just a few things you need to be aware of. Let me switch back over to the brush tool, and I don't mean to divert, but let me show you a way to do this. Now, I almost never use these little flyouts. As long as you know the hotkey, which we've already established is B, if I hold down Shift and hit B, you'll notice if you look over here in my tool panel, I'm cycling through each one of those tools that's found underneath that group. Very, very handy feature that keeps you from having to move your mouse all the way over there and hold down the mouse button. However, if you don't like the extra effort of having to hold down the Shift key with your pinky while you tap the B key, you can come under Edit, jump down to your Preferences, and go under General. And you'll notice, I guess about a little less than halfway down, you'll see Use Shift key for Tool Switch. If you turn this off and click OK, then what you get is just the ability to tap the B key and cycle through everything located underneath that group. This is true for any of the other tools as well. So we saw that the E key was for the eraser, and if I hit the E key and keep tapping the E key, we cycle through all of the different kinds of erasers that we have access to. So if you want to be able to just jump through any of those tools by just spamming the hotkey a few times, it's a really good way to go about it. I kind of go back and forth with whether or not I prefer this. Sometimes I turn it on, and every now and then maybe my hands are shaky because I've had too much coffee, so I find myself turning it off. It's really just a matter of preference, and mine kind of changes with the wind in this one regard. Alright, so let's jump back over to the Paintbrush tool and talk just about a couple of things. Now, I'm back over to using a digital tablet for my drawing. So if you notice my brush strokes get a little more fluid and yours feel a little bit jerky, don't worry. That's not because I'm really fancy with a mouse. That's because I actually have a pen in my hand. Now, if you just click and drag, you are, of course, just drawing out a line. Also, just to kind of throw out a quick aside to the audience, if you notice that my line has a slightly different quality than yours, like maybe my line goes from being really faint to really thick, and if you're using a mouse, you won't get that result. If that's making you curious, that's because my digital tablet has some pressure sensitivity to it. If I just push very, very softly, I get a faint little line, and if I push really hard, I get a really fat line. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works in a moment. But if you are using a mouse, you won't have access to that pressure sensitivity. So there's the difference between our two results. Also, because I have a tablet, I don't necessarily have to go hit the E key to get my eraser out. I can just flip my pen over, and the drivers for my tablet automatically know that I've done that, and it's just like having an eraser on a pencil, and I can go ahead and start erasing. Another really good reason to pick up a tablet if you want one, because if your two most common things, which are painting and erasing, are right there just by flipping a pen over, which if you've ever used a real-world pencil, it's the most natural thing in the world. If you see me do that, if you see me suddenly start erasing, please understand all I've done is flip my pen over. And I will try to mention when I do that so that you'll know to reach over and tap the E key if you need to and you're following along with the mouse. Okay, enough of all that. We've already seen how clicking and dragging can create lines. You can also hold down the Shift key, and that will allow you to draw out straight lines. Do be aware, though, if you continue holding down the Shift key and you click somewhere else on your document, what you're going to end up with is a line, and it's a little bit faint there, that jumps all the way back to your new starting point. Let me do it with my mouse to make it a little more apparent. So I'm going to hold down Shift and click and drag, and you'll notice my line is constrained. If you take a look at where my cursor is, my brush stroke is actually constrained to that straight line. Now, without letting go of Shift, if I move my cursor down here to the lower left-hand corner of the canvas, and I click, notice we get a line that automatically connects the two. So I've just drawn like a great big letter Z. Sometimes that can be good, sometimes that can also be a little bit annoying, so just be aware that it happens. If you just want to make a whole bunch of straight lines and you don't want them connected, make sure that in between strokes you release the Shift key, then hold it back down after you start your brush stroke. So you're going to hold down Shift, drag out a brush stroke, come to your next line, click and hold the mouse button, then hit Shift and drag out your next line. It's just kind of a pattern you have to sort of get the hang of. But it's very easy once you get the flow for it. If you mess it up and you're always holding down your Shift key, you're going to get these little diagonal lines connecting what you're doing. Okay, now once again, I'm holding down Control, Alt, and tapping Z a few times just to get rid of all those extra brush strokes. Something else you may want to do when you're painting is change the size of the brush. Now there are several different ways to go about this. The one I'm going to focus on, at least for the moment, is the bracket keys on your keyboard, because I'm a big hotkey proponent. So if I tap the right bracket key, you'll notice my brush getting bigger and bigger and bigger. If I tap the left bracket key, you'll see it getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So just to give you a quick demonstration, we click over here, draw out a line, tap the right bracket key several times, boom, and you see it getting bigger. If your eyes jump up to the options box, you can actually see the number of pixels that defines the radius of that brush. So currently it's a 60 radius brush, or 60 pixel radius. As I tap the left bracket key, you can see that number getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now I'm going to switch over to my eraser. Of course, hit the E key if you need to. I just flipped my pen over because I've got a nice fancy tablet to play with. Alright, so there's changing the size of your brush, which is very handy, but Something else you're probably going to want to do if you're actually trying to paint is change the color of your brush. Painting strictly in black and white is certainly cool for dramatic effect, but if you want to do anything fancier than that, you're going to need some color. So the way we're going to do that is by jumping down here to the color picker, which is located at the bottom of your tool panel. There are certainly other ways to go about it. You might have noticed if you're using the Essentials workspace that you have a color panel up here that allows you to adjust some RGB sliders as well as use a color picker in the middle of the rainbow, so to speak, to pick what color you like. That's certainly a nice way to pick colors. You also have a Swatches panel where you can just choose a whole bunch of predefined colors and even create some of your own predefined colors by clicking on the new color swatch if you want to do that. However, what I want to focus on is using the color picker itself, which is again located down here at the lower left-hand corner of your screen at the bottom of your tool panel. Now it has two different color swatches associated with it. You have your foreground color, which is in the upper left, and then the background color, which is in the lower right. We're going to set the foreground color to some darkish shade of green and click OK. And then you'll see as we paint, we're painting in green. Actually, let me make my brush a little bit bigger so I don't have to scribble quite so much, because really all we're doing is just getting some strokes out to show the color change. Then I can click another color. Let's do some sort of shade of orange. And there you go. It really couldn't be much easier. Now, the background color is something else entirely. Painting with a background color is not something that the paintbrush is going to be doing by default. There are some ways you can utilize the background color while painting, and we'll talk about those here very shortly. For now, though, let's talk a little bit about these two little tiny buttons floating right above the color swatch. We've got one that looks like a little miniature version of the color picker. What this does is this sets the default foreground and background colors. Basically, it sets everything to black and white. The hotkey for doing this is the D key. So if you tap the D key or you click this little tiny button, your colors go right back to black and white. It's kind of a useful combination to have, more useful than you think, as I go ahead and erase out those brush strokes. Because if you are painting, let's say I've got some incredible shade of blue that I'm painting with, and I'm working, I'm jamming, and I just say, you know what, I need to trace this one part in black real quick. You can just tap the D key and you're already back to having black. Now the other button right next to this, which has the little tiny two-sided bent arrow, that allows you to swap the foreground and background colors. The hotkey for that is X. So keep in mind the D key and the X key. Watch what happens when I hit X. Notice the foreground is now white, the background is now black, or I can click that little button and it does exactly the same thing. Very, very fancy to have access to that. So if I want to, I can be painting in black, and then if I need to switch over to white or whatever my background color happens to be, I can just hit the X key and now I'm painting in white. Now, the place where that comes in really handy is if you know that you're going to be working in a couple of different colors, say red and blue. So I'll take my foreground color and I'll set it to some really obnoxious shade of blue. I'll take my background color and set it to red. So now I can paint in blue, tap X, and I'm immediately painting in red. Very, very fast swap out. So there's a quick look at using our color picker. Now, just to give you a quick overview of the color picker itself, of course, you have the great big click and drag area that takes whatever your current hue is and allows you to choose what value and brightness you'd like to use. So what saturation as you go from left to right, and what brightness as you go from top to bottom. And if you take a look at the numbers over here on the right-hand side, you can actually see those updating. Watch as I drag my arrows here along the rainbow. You'll notice the hue is updating through degrees of the rainbow, and that goes all the way up to 360. So you go from 0, which is red, up to 360, which is technically still red. So it'll go up to 359, and it'll wrap back around. And then as I move from left to right, you'll notice that it's saturation that's updating. If you see brightness updating a little bit, that's just because I can't move my hand in a perfectly straight line. So left to right controls saturation, and then brightness is by moving up and down. And so as you move around in 2 dimensions, you can change both those numbers at the same time. Now you have 2 different ways, actually you have 4 different ways to choose what color you'd like to use. You have HSB, which is hue, saturation, and brightness. You have RGB, which is red, green, and blue. This goes from 0 to 255. If you are familiar with other color pickers from other applications that use 0 to 1 standard, please note that 0 to 1 is mapped to 0 to 255 in the case of Photoshop. You can use lab colors, which is just another format for choosing which actual color, and then you have CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, or key. And then finally, if you want, you can actually grab the hex value for that particular color, which is extremely useful for web applications, because if you're doing things like CSS, style sheets will take in that hex number for a specific color. So just another cool little feature. You can also check this little box over here and see only those colors which are registered specifically for use on the web. Now, I generally don't do that, of course. Okay, so there's just a quick rundown of the basics of the color picker. Most of the time, I am either just grabbing colors out intuitively. You know, I'll know that I need some shade of purple, so I'll grab my little hue selector, slide it along the rainbow to somewhere around purple, and then I'll grab exactly that shade or tint of purple that I need. If I know I need a specific color, I will often just take a look at setting up my RGB values. I'm actually a little more familiar with RGB as opposed to HSB, but I kind of jump back and forth a little bit. Like if I know I have the right shade, but I need it to be a little brighter, then I know I can jump over to HSB and start adjusting that. Finally, there are a few colors out there that I know just from their hex values from some of my web work, and that becomes pretty handy as well. For instance, one of the orange colors that we use quite often over on 3D Buzz is FF9000, which is a very intense shade of orange. So just a quick look at that. Okay, so there's a nice rundown of the color picker. Now let's see, what else do I want to talk about? The only thing I really want to cover are the options bars for the paintbrush and at least the pencil tool. Now these are pretty straightforward. There are some aspects of the options bar that I won't be going into in any significant depth just because we'll be talking a lot more about that kind of thing in future videos. First off, if we have the brush selected, so make sure you have the brush selected and not the pencil tool because the options are a little different between the two, and we jump from left to right, first off, we have some presets for the tool. Now, Photoshop comes with a few of these presets by default, so we have Airbrush Soft Round 50% Flow is the name of that brush. So if we click on that, all of these settings get adjusted for us, and now we have an airbrush style brush. And we can create our own particular settings, our own presets if we want. So if you take these and you set them all to something that you really like, you can just come over here and click New and create a brand new preset, name it anything you like. Next, we have our brush selector. So there's the little tiny arrow here next to our little profile of the brush itself. This allows us to manually change the size of the brush. So there it is at 2500 pixels, which is so big, it just kind of covers the entire canvas, which is not necessarily something we want to do. We can also adjust the hardness of the brush. So if you take a look at the little icon for our brush profile located up here at the top, as I increase the hardness, you'll notice that it's getting a lot harder around the edges. There's not as much softening around the outer edge. Finally, there are a series of different types of brushes that you can choose as well. Now, these are pretty straightforward, at least with the basic installation of Photoshop. You've got a selection of soft brushes and hard brushes by default. You'll also notice these little brushes, depending on if you have a tablet attached. You may notice these brushes that look actually like the end of a real paintbrush. These are meant to be used along with a digital tablet. And the reason is that, at least in the case of my Wacom tablet, let me go ahead and just I'm going to clean off my entire canvas. The way I'm going to do this is hit D, here my view. And what D is going to do is switch me back to my default colors, so that's black and white. Then I'm going to hit Control A to select everything in the canvas, and then I'm going to hit Delete. Actually, let me hit... Oh, it thinks I want to use fill. Okay, well I don't necessarily want to use fill. So to keep things nice and easy, I'll just go under Edit and choose Clear, and that'll clear everything out. So now let's hit Control D and deselect. Now you'll notice that I get this nice little 3D icon of my brush up in the top of my view, and what this is doing is showing me the current tilt of my pen, which, as you can see, that changes the nature of the brush stroke. So if I tilt the pen off to the side and draw a brush stroke, we get this. If I keep the pen perfectly vertical, we get something different entirely. So it's a very intuitive way to work as I really waggle my pen around. And Photoshop tries to give you a nice rendition of what your brush is actually doing over here on the left-hand side, if you care to look at that. It's kind of like a closed caption view of what your brush is doing, and you can make that bigger or smaller. Or if you don't like it, you can close it out altogether. I just thought I'd mention that in case you are staring at these different styles of brush in here and you're wondering what those are for. Now you also have some basic image brushes. What these are little tiny images, like so, and you can paint with them and they kind of create their own interesting styles. They can get some really nice artistic looks, so very cool feature to have. So let's go ahead and just undo all these, and I'm going to hit Control D to get rid of those marching ants from that selection. Now, by the way, that's just deselect. That's Control D. Try not to take any of my hotkeys for granted. Alright, so by all means, feel free to play with a lot of these brushes. You can also download and add brushes, which is something that I'm not going to try to cram in here. That's something we'll work into a short little separate video all on its own. Now, let's take a look at the remaining options for the brush tool. In fact, let me go ahead and switch back over to a soft round brush. Now, next to this, we have the toggle brush panel. I'm not going to go into the brush panel at the moment. The reason being, as you can see, it has a whole lot of different options, and I'm trying to keep this video a little bit focused just to the basics. We'll go into the brush panel in a separate video. Next, we have the blend mode. You can think of the blend mode as the way in which your paint, or your ink, if you want to think of it as ink, is being blended with whatever colors are already on your canvas. I'm not going to go into each one of these right now. That's something that we will discuss in an entirely separate video dedicated only to blend modes. But again, it's just a way for you to control how two different colors are being blended together. Just to give you a really quick example, if I grab, say, a shade of medium quality red and just kind of paint right in here. Now that's with normal mode. Now I'm going to take my my blend mode and let's set it to something kind of interesting, like, I don't know, let's try hue. And then I'm going to change my color over to some shade of blue. In fact, a really different shade of blue. If I try to paint out here, I'm not getting anything. But as I come across my initial stroke, you'll see that that shifts over to a shade of blue. And that's because what I'm doing is I'm actually swapping out the hue value, which, if we go back to the color picker, that's our point along the rainbow, so to speak. We're swapping that out for the new hue. So instead of having a hue of somewhere around 0, we now have a hue of 243. So it's just kind of a special way that the two colors were blended together. So it's just a really quick overview of kind of what blend modes do. I'm going to set this back over to normal. I'm going to switch over to my eraser and just clean that out. Now, of course, once again, hit the E key if you don't have just a tablet pen that you can just flip over. Next we have opacity, and what opacity does is it controls how, I love this, it controls the see-throughness. That's not my word, somebody once said that to me and it just kind of stuck. Opacity controls the see-throughness of each brushstroke you have. Now you might have seen me casually set my flow back up to 100%. That's because earlier on when I was talking about presets, I did click on the airbrush soft round 50% flow, and that set my flow back over to 50. So for the purposes of the rest of the demo, I'll slide this back over to 100 for a moment. Now let's go ahead and grab some obnoxious shade of green, and if I draw a stroke up here across the top, back and forth a couple times, you see what that looks like. Now if I take my opacity and pull it down to somewhere close to 20%, I guess 18 in this case, you can just barely see that brush stroke. It's just barely showing up, and we can set it maybe over to 50%. And there you go. Now I can start layering these on top of each other, so boom. And you can see where that opacity will start to accumulate. So opacity is a very, very powerful feature, especially if you're doing some painting and trying to get shading just right. You can really start layering those brush strokes one on top of the other and get some nice layered effects. So let's go ahead and clean all this out. Actually, let me just do it this way. We'll just switch over to my mighty eraser, and I'll increase the size of my eraser. The way I did that, by the way, once again, was just using the right bracket key. Just tap it a few times, and my eraser gets nice and big. Now moving over from here, we got this little kind of obscure button, which if you are using a mouse will mean nothing to you. This allows you to control whether tablet pressure drives the opacity of your strokes. And to really show you how that works, one, you have to have a digital tablet. If you don't have a digital tablet, then you don't have pressure sensitivity anyway. But since this is currently switched off for this brush, I can turn it on. And now if I do a really faint stroke, I'm hardly pushing. You'll notice my brush is very, very faint. And the harder I push, as I start applying more and more pressure, we get a much more solid stroke. It's a very natural way to work. It's extremely useful, and another reason for you to go ahead and buy a digital tablet if you really want to take painting in Photoshop very seriously. Okay, let's go ahead and turn that off for now, though. Next, we have flow. This controls how much the ink is kind of being sprayed onto the canvas. It's useful if you're trying to create something like an airbrush style effect. So if I turn this down and I start painting, we get nothing at first, but it's as I continue to sort of scrub across, we get thicker and thicker application. Let me turn it really, really low. So there it is at 8%. And you'll notice it's almost like using a dry marker in a way. As I keep going back over each stroke, we get more and more of our paint being applied until we finally reach maximum opacity. Now you might be thinking, well, how is that different than opacity? Let me show you the difference. Let me set my flow back up to 100%, and I'll take my opacity all the way down to, well, something low, something around 10%. Now, as I paint back and forth over this initial stroke, you really can't even see anything, and it's not getting any darker. That's because the way opacity accumulates is with different strokes. So if I release the mouse or I pull my pen up and then make another stroke, now they're starting to layer on top of one another. So let me go ahead and pull that up to, say, 30% so you can really see the difference. So here's one stroke at 30%, and notice I can just keep going back over it over and over again, and it's not getting any darker. But I go one more time, and now it's darker. I go again, and now it's darker. And each time I'm actually creating a brand new stroke until eventually we make it all the way up to full 100% opacity. Flow, on the other hand, allows you to steadily get more and more ink applied as the stroke overlays itself. So all with one stroke, I can keep going back and forth over it, and then finally we end up with full opacity. So there's your difference between flow and opacity. Now I'm going to go ahead and erase all that out. Go ahead and put that back up to 100%. Now also, we have the ability to control, we can set this into airbrush mode, and if I do this and then pull opacity down, what's going to happen is as I sit still, and actually it'll be easier to see if I make my brush nice and big, so I'm going to spam the right bracket key until it gets nice and big. I can just click and hold the mouse button down, and you'll notice that it just steadily gets darker. So if I just click for a moment, we get a really faint stroke, but if I click and hold, it eventually gets all the way up to full opacity. And as you turn the flow down, that controls how quickly that fill-in takes place. So here at 4%, it takes a good while to get all the way up to full opacity. And as I click and drag, you'll see I start off with something very faint. And everywhere my mouse slows down, we get a lot more paint right there in that one little area. So let's go ahead and erase all that out. Next, we get the ability to control the size of our brush with our pressure sensitivity. Once again, if you have a mouse, this is not really going to be particularly helpful to you. Let's go ahead and set our flow back up to 100%. I'm going to make sure I'm not in airbrush mode, and I'm going to scale my brush down really far to about here. Now, in fact, let me pull it to, I guess, about here. Now, if I make a really, really faint stroke, and I don't know, I just like having a softer brush. That's just me, though. So if I do, let me turn this on too. I guess it would help if I actually turn the option on if I want to talk about the option. You're welcome to send me an email and make fun of me for that. So if I drag really, really softly across my tablet, you'll notice I have this little tiny stroke. And you can actually see how my hand is wavering a little bit because the stroke is getting thinner here and there. But if I push down all the way, the stroke steadily gets bigger and bigger and bigger all the way up to full size. And that's because right now the brush's size is being controlled by how hard I push down, which is a very realistic feel in terms of how things like soft markers and paintbrushes actually work. So it's very, very useful. All right, so there is a rundown of the options bar for the paintbrush. Again, there's some of the things we didn't talk about to any great depth because I want to save those and put them in their own little videos. Now let's take just a moment and jump over to the pencil tool. Now the pencil tool has its own settings. Most of them are exactly like the paintbrush, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about them. First off, if you go into the presets, you have some presets that you can create, but none come with the pencil tool because it's such a basic thing. Also, hardness for the pencil tool is irrelevant. The pencil tool is always going to be hard. If I was to zoom, you always get those little pixel jaggies. That's because every single pixel that is used with the pencil tool is going to be at 100% opacity. You'll get no aliasing, which is the kind of blurring around pixel edges. Now let's go back to our pencil tool. We can open up the brush panel like we saw earlier, but I'm not going to discuss that at the moment. We have our blend mode, which we've already discussed, but we're going to go into a lot more depth on that in a later video. We can control the opacity of the pencil tool. So if I pull this down to, say, 29%, and let me get something other than green. I've done so many green lines now that I'm starting to get bored of them. So let's switch over to blue. And here we are with a 29% pencil stroke. And then if I create another pencil stroke on top of that, you can see how wherever the two intersect, we get a little more opacity. It builds up, but please note there is no flow setting in the pencil tool. Now, we can control that opacity with pressure sensitivity using this little override button. I do want to mention this, and it's mentioned in the tooltip, but if you didn't actually get a chance to see that, this button will override whatever you set in your brush settings. So earlier on, I mentioned the brush panel, and these are all your brush settings. Inside this window, you can control pressure sensitivity, but if you change the button up here, this overrides whatever's going on inside that window. And again, we'll talk more about the brush panel just a little bit later. Now next we have auto erase. I don't really like that term, and I'll show you why, but before I do, I just want to mention this final button here at the end. This is just the same thing we saw earlier with the paintbrush. The tablet pressure is going to control the size of your brush, which there's no need to go over that. You've already seen it. Now, auto erase, what this is going to do is automatically flip-flop between the foreground and the background colors depending on where you lay your stroke down. So what I'm going to do is set my background color to red. So we have a blue foreground, red background. Watch this. If I click and start drawing with the pencil tool, you see we're putting down blue. And if I click out here in open space, we're still putting down blue. But if I click in the middle of an existing stroke, we're suddenly painting with the background color, which is red. That's not necessarily auto-erasing, but it can look that way, and it's a little bit deceiving. And the reason I say that is watch this. If I hit D, and once again, that goes back to my default colors of black and white, and I click out here in open space, you'll see that we are painting with black, and that's great. If I click on an existing stroke that is already black, if anything that is already the foreground color, then we are painting white. This is not erasing. I just want to go on record saying that this is not erasing. Currently, it looks like erasing. Do you know why it looks like erasing? Because our piece of paper happens to be white. This is actually like painting with white paint, and I'm going to prove it to you. Let me go ahead and erase everything out. So I'm going to switch over to my eraser. Again, I'm just flipping my pen over, but you would hit the E key if you don't have a tablet to work with. And I'm not going to do what I just did, which is accidentally draw a stroke. I'm going to create a new layer. Now, we haven't talked much about layers, but you can still do this. All I'm going to do is go over to the Layers panel, which by default, if you're using the Essentials workspace, which you should be, if you're not, then click on the Essentials workspace at the top of your view, hit the little double arrows at the very top and go down to Reset Essentials, and that'll put everything back to exactly what you see here. Come down to your Layers panel, and at the very bottom, there's this little tiny icon that looks like a piece of paper with its corner folded up, and that will create a brand new layer. Now this layer is just like a sheet of transparency that we can draw on. So what I want you to do is paint a little bit, and we still have auto erase on. You'll see that I can click on that existing stroke, and we get white, and that's very fancy. Now watch this. I'm going to come over here to my background, and I'm going to add another layer. Watch what happens. The new layer actually appears underneath our initial layer we created a moment ago. So we have the layer that we've drawn on, and we have another clear sheet directly underneath that. And we'll talk more about layers and the order in which they appear and how important that is just a little bit later on. Now I'm going to do something fancy. I'm going to take my foreground color, and I'm going to set this to dark blue. Let's pick another color. Let's do brown. That'll be great. And I'm going to make my brush nice and big. So I'm spamming the right bracket key, and I'm just going to fill this whole thing in with brown. Now take a look at what's actually going on here. If we jump all the way back up to our first layer, and I'm going to hit the D key to go back to black and white, so remember, D key is for your default colors, and I'll shrink my brush back down with the left bracket key. Watch. We're painting, and then I try to paint on that initial stroke, and because auto erase is on, it's just painting white. It's not really erasing. If it was erasing, here's what we would get. We would be seeing brown. So all of that just to explain that the term auto erase is kind of a misnomer. All it's really doing is flip-flopping between your foreground color and your background color. If your background color happens to be the same color as whatever it is you're painting on, then yeah, it's going to look like it's an eraser, but it really isn't, so please don't confuse the two. Okay, finally, and I'm almost done, I promise, we'll give everybody a break here in just a moment. We have the eraser tool, which also has its own set of options. I'm just going to go over these very lightly because the only option that is totally new is erase to history, and that's not something that I'm going to go over right now because we haven't really discussed history yet, and it's a little bit of an involved discussion. But we have presets just like we did before. We can control the size and softness of the brush just like we did with the paintbrush. We can open up our brush presets, which we're not going to do. We're not going to play with, but we can open it up and have a look at it. We have a new selector here, which is for the mode. Let me go ahead and put away my brush preset, my brush panel. Our mode can be set to brush, to pencil, or to block. And the reason this is important, if I jump back down to this layer that I painted brown, I'm just going to click on that layer, and you can see here inside its little thumbnail that it is completely brown. If I erase a stroke in brush mode, and in fact I'm going to shrink my brush down a little bit. Of course I'm doing that just by hitting the left bracket key a few times, and I'm going to soften my brush a little bit by jumping over to my little drop down here and taking my hardness and sliding it down to 0%. Now watch this. We erase a little bit of that brown out, and you'll see that's very soft. It's got some almost like a glow effect to it because you're just getting some really soft erasing around the edges. Now if I switch over to pencil mode, hardness completely becomes irrelevant, just like drawing with the pencil. Finally, we have block mode, which is very much like pencil mode if you're using a square brush. This is very nice if you need to erase single pixels, because you can tap your left bracket key and... Actually, I'm sorry, my mistake. This actually doesn't work on the left bracket key at all. The way this works is the block always stays the same size no matter what your zoom factor is. So currently we're zoomed all the way in, and so I can erase individual pixels as you see here. And I did that by hitting the zoom key or the Z key, and that opens up the zoom tool. So if we're zoomed in really far and we use block mode, you'll see we're killing out individual pixels. If I hit Z and I zoom back out, and I did that just by clicking and dragging to the left, and I get my eraser back out, you'll notice that the block is pretty much the same size it was before, and now we're taking out much bigger chunks. The only time I ever use block mode is when I am nuking out individual pixels, which sometimes I have to do for web graphics. Now, if we go back over to brush mode, opacity suddenly becomes active. That does exactly what you think it does. If we lower the opacity, we're really just not erasing as much. And we've got to layer our strokes if we eventually want to chisel our way all the way back down. And that is kind of cool because we just inadvertently created kind of a glowy effect. Next, we can control that opacity with our pressure sensitivity, as we've already seen. The flow settings work exactly like the brush. So really, you just got to think it's kind of like an eraser that you could spray down. Finally, we have erase to history. I'm not going to go over that right now because we haven't really discussed the idea of history in Photoshop. And again, that is kind of its own involved sort of discussion. And then finally, at the very end, we can control the size of our eraser using pressure sensitivity. Okay, so that's a rundown of your brush basics, and I've eaten up almost 40 minutes of your time just going over those settings, really just for 3 tools. But that is going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.